Hi, this is Dr. Beth Corbo, and I welcome you to Lecture 1G. Here we are going to discuss Seufer's chapter. It's in the 4th edition of the Multisensory Teaching of Basic Language Skills, and this chapter provides an excellent account of the relationship between aspects of oral language and literacy. It explains some of the similarities and differences between oral language and print language. Seufer describes the role of various aspects of language impairment to literacy acquisition and performance. In this brief lecture, we will take a look at some of the highlights of this chapter. Seufer says on page 4 that literacy is much like a great pyramid. It is built on a broad foundation that is linguistic, sociological, cognitive, and pedagogic. While we know that learning to read and write is not natural, learning to speak is. But if our children are to develop the language of school, they need to develop the metalinguistic awareness that permits a child to view language as an entity, or, as Seufer says, something to be considered and analyzed. How interesting that when we study discrete aspects of our language, phonics, grammar, vocabulary, we use the very language being studied to learn about the language being used. Language is certainly fascinating, as is its relationship to literacy development. Seufer tells us that the following enables a listener to understand language: recognizing word patterns, word structure and sentence forms, knowing the meanings of words, how words relate to one another, and how they're influenced by their position in the sentence. Along with this, we need to interpret the intent of the speaker within the context and in relationship to one's own knowledge base. We know that understanding written language demands the same linguistic understandings necessary for spoken language. This chapter describes how problems with language, syntax, morphology, semantics, or pragmatics, can have a negative effect on reading comprehension. Metalinguistic ability, as Seufer discusses, permits a child to focus on language from a distance. Metalinguistic ability allows us and our students to view language as an object of consideration. It is metalinguistic awareness that allows children to recognize word boundaries, to make letter-sound correspondences, to consider which printed sequence of letters represent which words and meanings, to analyze, blend, and reconstruct words. Seufer tells us that there is little, if anything, in the oral language experience that prepares children to view words as discrete units or to isolate the parts of each unit. It is a separate skill from competence of spoken language. This competence can be unconscious. You can be a competent speaker and not even realize it, as it is a naturally developed skill for most children. On the other hand, oral language development does not require metalinguistic abilities. Our speech stream is continuous. We can't hear boundaries between words. Think about listening to a language that's foreign to you. You will not hear pauses between each word. And in oral language development, reflection on linguistic knowledge is not part of the process early on. This type of reflection occurs only after a fair degree of linguistic sophistication has been attained. Let's reflect a bit about the differences between oral and written language. Remember that in the course of human development, literacy is quite recent, and learning to read and write does not come naturally to everyone. And on top of that, these skills are not a requirement in every society. So while we have a biological predisposition to oral language, reading and writing are acquired deliberately. Reading and writing do not develop spontaneously and naturally, as does oral language. Seufer tells us that oral language is transient and ephemeral, existing only at the moment when it's spoken. Most oral language occurs face to face, where the speaker and listener use context and situational support, as in vocal, facial, and physical gestures, to clarify. Therefore, less needs to be explicitly stated, and sentence structures can be more fragmented. Vocabulary can be less academic, and syntax more familiar and less sophisticated. So, it is just the best, most talented writers who can arrange and adapt their words, clauses, and sentences in ways that communicate so effectively that it seems as though these writers are talking right to you. Phonological awareness abilities are critical to the development of oral reading. As teachers, we need to be aware that the intelligibility of speech can be related to phonological awareness development. We know that children who have problems with speech sound production at the time they are being introduced to reading instruction are often less adept at tasks of phonological awareness than their peers, who have more typically developing speech production. Seufer informs us that speech production precludes efficient phonological coding in working memory, making articulation ability an important prerequisite for acquiring awareness of phoneme structures. So, while we are well aware that while phonological awareness abilities are critical to the development of early reading, the evidence also supports our ability to identify weaknesses in phonological awareness and, more importantly, intervene and strengthen these skills. Let's reflect just a bit on morphological awareness in reading difficulty. Seufer tells us that the rate of morphological acquisition is slower for children who struggle with reading than for their typically developing peers. While morphological awareness has not been studied like phonological awareness, several investigations have pointed to the relationship between morphological awareness and literacy. Seufer cites students showing that morphology is relevant to both reading and spelling for several reasons. The role morphology plays in orthography, the value of morphemes as indicators of meaning, the economical nature of storing words in written lexicon as morphemes. Syntax is a third aspect of language Seufer discusses. Syntax is a system of rules that directs comprehension and production of sentences. We sometimes refer to syntax as grammar. Syntax specifies the order of words and the organization of words within a variety of sentence types. It directs the order of words within sentences and clauses. So, while phonological knowledge and skills are relevant to early decoding, morphological and syntactic knowledge are critical to fluency and comprehension. If children have difficulty with syntax, the effect on their reading may not be obvious until late in elementary school, when the emphasis shifts from decoding. Remember that oral language is supported by interaction between speaker and listener. However, far fewer cues are available to a reader of written text. It is far easier for a reader to fail to accurately analyze sentence structure, resulting in limited comprehension. It is important to remember that the elements of language phonology, morphology, and syntax have clear relations to one another as one aspect of the foundation of which literacy is built. Seufer reminds us that early ability is strongly connected to phonological knowledge. Later, morphological knowledge adds to the skills required for spelling and comprehension. And then, reading development, fluency, and comprehension have their roots in morphology and syntax while continuing to rely on efficient phonological processing. Language content, often referred to as semantics, is the meaning component of language. Seufer tells us that language content reflects world knowledge and what we know about objects, events, and relationships. The process of learning to assign meaning to language begins in infancy. Seufer informs us that meaning can be represented in a word, in a sentence, or across sentences, as well as in non-linguistic ways. As children develop, their mental dictionary or lexicon develops. This lexicon stores not only individual word meanings, but how words can be used. Children develop vocabulary at a rapid rate from the toddler years on, largely dependent on the nature of the exposure to words that they experience. Learning a word is a long-term developmental process. Research has shown that effective vocabulary instruction involves the creation of word-rich classroom environments, independent word learning, development of authentic instructional strategies, and the use of realistic assessments. As children become literate, the opportunities for growth in semantic knowledge grow considerably. Seufer says, After children learn to read, reading becomes a vehicle for learning. Or, more commonly stated, after children learn to read, they read to learn. The language of the classroom is different from everyday language used for social interaction. In school, there's a greater degree of formality. The choice of words is often more abstract and unfamiliar. Sentence structures are more complex. The topics, which are controlled and related to text, the rate of the speech is faster, and above all, the language of school is decontextualized. This contrasts with everyday conversations when people are supported by context in cues such as facial expressions, gestures, tone, and even the presence of the object being discussed. It's so important to remember that this leaves our students vulnerable. They are at risk for comprehension difficulties with conversation and narrative despite having decoding skills. When a child has adequate social language skills, the more hidden these vulnerabilities are. Seufer emphasizes the importance of providing direct instruction in narrative structure via storygrammars and in identifying and interpreting the author's intentions in order to improve a student's level of reading comprehension. Seufer stresses the importance of understanding that talking is not teaching. She explains that teachers must be empowered as communicators so that students can be successful and invigorated learners. For many of our students, understanding spoken language, especially the language of school, is a challenge. This challenge is directly connected to the acquisition of knowledge and appreciation of text. Seufer points out two essential understandings for teachers. Number one, the knowledge of the impact that the language teachers use has on children. Number two, the conscious awareness of what teachers say and how we say it. Throughout this comprehensive chapter, Seufer has shown us that to be effective as a teacher, it is essential to understand that we are teaching language and that we must have this kind of control when teaching. I sincerely hope that this chapter is one that you will return to time and time again. It is so full of information, and each time you reread, you will learn something new. Oral language development is fascinating and well worth the time that we spend learning how to develop our students' language. The more that we use language to think about language, the better off our students will be. Thank you so much for listening.